The shot came from inside the perimeter. Staff Sergeant Evelyn Cross heard it before she understood it. A single suppressed crack, swallowed immediately by rain hammering jungle canopy. Across the compound, a U.S. officer buckled mid-sentence at the briefing table. His coffee cup hit the floor. Nobody moved for 2 full seconds. Evelyn swept her scope left, then right. Thermals showed nothing but green heat bloom and falling water. The canopy ate everything. Then she saw it. 800 meters out, a broken solar panel on the abandoned relay tower. A reflection. Wrong angle, wrong shape. Someone was already watching her. And the man bleeding out in the compound below, he'd been running an audit. Cut to black. The jungle had a pulse. Evelyn Cross had learned to read it the way other people read clocks. The rhythm of insects, the spacing between bird calls, the weight of silence when something moved wrong. She'd been in this canopy hide for 11 hours, and in that time she'd cataloged 43 separate sounds, dismissed 42 of them, and marked the 43rd for later review. The 43rd was a vegetation disturbance, southeast, at approximately 0314 hours. It had lasted 4 seconds and then stopped completely. An animal would have continued moving. A person had frozen. She'd swept the sector twice and found nothing, and she'd cataloged it as inconclusive rather than dismissing it, because inconclusive was honest, and dismissed was wishful thinking. In the field, wishful thinking got people killed. It was 0527 hours. The light came in gray and wet, filtered through 3 layers of vegetation before it reached her face. She didn't wipe the moisture from her cheek. Movement created pattern. Pattern created profile. Profile got you killed. Her rifle, a Mk-22 MOAS chambered in .300 Norma Magnum, rested in a bipod cradle she'd constructed from stripped vine and paracord. The suppressor was beaded with condensation. She'd checked it twice in the last hour, confirmed seal integrity, confirmed the lens was clean. The scope showed her a sector of jungle corridor 400 to 900 meters out, and right now it showed her nothing except green. That was expected. That was correct. That was the mission. FOB Sentinel sat 2 kilometers behind her, a patchwork of hardened prefab and local construction bolted onto a ridge above the Darién borderland. Officially, it was a joint U.S.-Colombian counter-narcotics advisory outpost. Officially, there were 42 personnel, a logistics chain routed through Howard Air Force Base in Panama, and a narrow rules of engagement framework focused on intelligence gathering and force protection. Unofficially, it was a listening post at the edge of a war nobody was calling a war. Her earpiece clicked twice, low band encrypted. "How's the coffee up there?" The voice was unhurried, faintly hoarse. A man who'd spent decades talking into radios and had long since stopped performing for them. "There is no coffee," she said. "First rule of field positions, always bring coffee." "What's the second rule?" "Never tell anyone where you got the coffee." A brief pause. "Sector clear?" "Corridors quiet, wildlife pattern nominal. Winds picking up from the southwest. Going to affect my calc past 600. "Noted." Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Mercer's voice carried the particular flatness of a man processing multiple information streams simultaneously. "I'm seeing the supply manifest from yesterday's convoy. Something's off." "Off how?" "Fuel allocation doesn't match vehicle count. 1,200 liters logged against 9 vehicles. Even running hot in this terrain, you don't burn that in a 2-day run." Evelyn kept her eye on the scope. "Accounting error." "Maybe." He didn't sound convinced. "Get some food in you. Long day ahead." She reached without looking and found the energy bar she'd wedged between her knee and the hide floor. Bit off a corner, chewed without enthusiasm. Below her, the jungle corridor remained empty and indifferent. She rotated off the hide at 0800 descending via a route she'd mapped herself. 3 waypoints, 2 doublebacks, 1 water crossing that soaked her boots to the ankle and was worth it for the trail obfuscation. She reached the wire at 0847. FOB Sentinel was not impressive up close. 12 structures, most of them modular, connected by gravel paths that the rain was slowly converting back to mud. A comms array on the north end, a motor pool with 4 MRAPs and a pair of aging Colombian military trucks. A medical bay that doubled as an equipment room. A briefing structure, hardened, with blast deflectors on 3 sides, that served as the operational nerve center. Mercer was waiting outside it with 2 metal cups, one extended toward her. Thought there was no coffee. There's bad coffee. He handed her the cup. Different category. It was bad. Aggressively bad. She drank it anyway. Daniel Mercer was 62 years old, and he wore that age the way old vehicles wear high mileage. Not as deterioration, but as evidence. His face was weathered into deep horizontal lines. His eyes were the color of creek water, and they moved with the same quiet constancy as hers. He'd retired from the Army Rangers as a sergeant major 11 years ago and had cycled back into service as a civilian contractor intelligence liaison, the kind of role that existed in the gray space between official and informal, accountable to no particular chain of command, and therefore useful to several of them. They'd worked together twice before this assignment, once in Djibouti, once in a country whose name Evelyn had been told not to put in writing. Both times, Mercer had been right about things before the intelligence confirmed them. Both times, she'd wished she'd listened sooner. The logistics discrepancy, she said, you've seen it before. Similar patterns. He turned the cup in his hands. Horn of Africa, 2019. Fuel allocation drift, then supply chain anomalies, then a contractor vehicle spotted in a location it wasn't supposed to be. Took 3 months before anyone connected the dots. What happened when they did? Reassignments, some paperwork. Nobody went to prison. He said it without bitterness. That was somehow worse than bitterness. Evelyn looked at the briefing structure. Through the narrow window, she could see Lieutenant Colonel Warren Hayes reviewing something on a tablet. Hayes ran FOB Sentinel with the particular brand of efficiency that prioritized metrics. His after-action reports were precise and well-formatted. She'd read 2 of them and found nothing she disagreed with and nothing she fully trusted. You think Hayes is involved? She said. I think Hayes is ambitious, Mercer said. Those aren't always the same thing, but they're often adjacent. He finished his coffee. Focus on the mission. Suspected insurgent sniper in Sector 7. That's real, regardless of what else is happening. And if they're connected? He looked at her with those creek water eyes. Then we find out the hard way. He took her empty cup. Get cleaned up. Briefing at 10:00. She watched him walk back toward the comms array. He moved with the unhurried certainty of a man who had decided long ago which hills were worth dying on, and was quietly cataloging this one. She thought about Djibouti, 2022, a surveillance op that had turned bad in the 4th hour, when the target they were watching had walked into a building that Evelyn's intel said contained a secondary cell. Mercer had flagged it 40 minutes before it happened. Something wrong about the approach angle, the way the target's driver had looped the block twice. She'd logged it as nerves. Mercer had escalated it. He'd been right. The building was a kill box. The target had been burned. Their position had been compromised 3 minutes after the target went in, and they'd exfiltrated with 6 seconds to spare before the secondary cell swept the building. She'd asked him afterward how he'd known. Experience is just pattern recognition with a lot of failures attached, he'd said. She hadn't understood that answer then. She was beginning to understand it now. The 1000 briefing lasted 22 minutes. Hayes delivered it with a laser pointer and a voice that moved at the same pace regardless of what it was describing. Confirmed sightings of an insurgent sniper, designation Shadow, operating in the jungle corridor between grid references 447 and 531. 3 incidents in the last 10 days. 1 Colombian soldier wounded. 1 U.S. contractor vehicle disabled. Tires shot out at 400 meters, which was either luck or skill, and Evelyn's assessment was skill. A 3rd incident, still being evaluated, involving a patrol that had taken fire from an indeterminate direction and sustained no casualties, but had also recovered nothing useful. Cross, Hayes said, you'll establish Overwatch in Sector 7, grid 489 to 512. Primary objective, identify and eliminate shadow. Secondary objective, confirm route access points for upcoming resupply corridor. Rules of engagement, positive ID before engagement. Shadow is assessed as non-affiliated cartel associate, not a state actor. Standard counter-sniper protocol applies. She nodded. Counter-sniper protocol was straightforward in its language and complex in its execution. Positive ID at distance, in rain, under canopy, against an opponent who had already demonstrated the discipline to fire once and vanish. That was not a checklist. That was a sustained tactical problem with no clean answers. She noted that Hayes had described the Colombian soldier's wound as a graze. She'd read the incident report. The round had passed within 11 millimeters of the soldier's femoral artery. A graze by classification, a message by geometry. Weather forecast shows continued precipitation through the next 72 hours. Thermal degradation is a known factor. Mercer will be your intelligence support via encrypted channel. Hayes clicked off the laser pointer. Questions? No one had questions. Outside, the rain was intensifying. She could hear it against the blast deflectors, a sound like static, like interference, like something trying to get in. Mercer caught her at the door. He kept his voice low. Sector 7 overlaps with the fuel depot the 2019 contractor was using. I haven't confirmed it, but the geometry fits. She absorbed this. You're saying the sniper threat might be a pretext. I'm saying the sniper threat is real, and I'm saying it's possible someone is using a real threat for additional purposes. He pressed a folded paper into her hand. A grid reference, handwritten. If you see anything at that coordinate, tell me before you tell Hayes. She looked at the paper, memorized it, folded it back and put it in her breast pocket. What's at that coordinate? A ridge, he said. Steep gradient on the eastern face. Unstable geology. There was a survey done when they built this outpost. The rock's substrate is fractured shale above a clay substrate. Heavy rain increases saturation. If you disturb the ground at the right point, he paused, it's probably nothing. But if it's not nothing, then it becomes a decision point. He looked at her steadily. You're a good soldier, Evelyn. Good soldiers follow orders. But you're also a good thinker. Those two things don't always run parallel. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned and went to gear up. By 1400, she was back in position. A new hide, 40 meters northeast of the morning one. Better sightline into the deeper corridor. Worse protection from the southwest wind. She'd calculated the trade-off and chosen visibility. The rain had thickened. She could feel it working at the edges of her concealment, slowly flattening vegetation, slowly exposing angles. She repositioned twice in the first hour. Small adjustments, methodical. At 1537, the supply convoy that was supposed to arrive from the north came from the east instead. She noted it, logged it mentally. Convoys didn't change axis of approach without authorization and without reason. The eastern route added 40 minutes and crossed 2 water features that the northern route avoided. It made no tactical sense unless someone was avoiding a checkpoint or a surveillance position. At 1612, the wildlife went quiet. Not gradually, suddenly. One moment the background noise was complete, insects, birds, the ambient percussion of rain and canopy drip, and then it wasn't. A hole in the sound, roughly 200 meters northwest. Something had moved. and moved with enough disturbance to reset the acoustic environment. She adjusted her scope to the northwest quadrant, held there, waited. Wildlife silence was one of the oldest tactical indicators in the book. Every serious field operator knew it, which meant every serious field operator also knew it could be faked. By a large animal, by weather effect, by a ground disturbance unrelated to human presence. You didn't act on wildlife silence alone. You noted it, added it to the accumulating picture, and waited for the next data point to either confirm or dismiss it. She waited 4 minutes. The insects did not return. That was unusual. Insects resumed within 60 to 90 seconds of a disturbance that wasn't human. They had no fear of weather or animals, only of the particular scent and heat signature that meant predator. 4 minutes meant something was still in the zone, something that smelled like threat. Nothing resolved, but she kept the sector in rotation. At 1641, her radio channel produced 6 seconds of static at a frequency that wasn't weather or terrain interference. She recognized it. Deliberate jamming, narrowband, localized. Someone within range was suppressing communications. They did it once, for 6 seconds, and then stopped. She keyed her radio. Mercer, go ahead. Convoy came in from the east. A pause. I saw that. Radio interference at 1641, narrow band, 6 seconds. Another pause. Longer. I'll check the logs. There's something else. She kept her voice flat. The ridge you told me about, the fractured shale. Can you send me the survey reference? Why? She thought about the relay tower she'd noted at 0600 that morning, sitting on the ridgeline 800 meters out. It had been there when the outpost was built, old telecom infrastructure, abandoned. She'd categorized it as irrelevant background. She looked at it again now. Roof partially collapsed, solar panel cracked, one panel catching rain at an angle that created a faint reflection toward her position when conditions were right. She thought about sightlines, about geometry, about what you'd need to observe this hide location without thermal and without direct line of sight to the outpost. Because I want to know what's behind that tower, she said. Mercer didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had changed by a fraction, a quality she'd learned to recognize. Not alarm, confirmation of something suspected. I'll pull the survey, stay on scope. She stayed on scope. The corridor below remained quiet, but the quality of the quiet had changed, and she was now measuring it differently. At 1808, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes called an operations update meeting. Evelyn was too far out to attend. She monitored via radio, half her attention on the encrypted channel, half on the scope. Hayes was reviewing patrol schedules and resupply timelines. The meeting was routine. She let it run in the background. At 1823, mid-sentence, Hayes was describing corridor monitoring protocols. The shot happened. She heard it first. A single suppressed crack, moving through jungle air with the distinctive compression of a long barrel at distance. Not a pistol, rifle, heavy caliber. And the direction was wrong. Not from Sector 7, not from the corridor she was watching. From behind her. Interior. She spun the scope. She couldn't see the compound directly from this angle. The angle wasn't built for that. But she could see the briefing structure's north window, and she could see through it the sudden collapse of movement that meant someone had fallen. The radio erupted. Man down! Man down! Briefing structure! Medic! Lockdown! Lockdown! She was already scanning. Thermal on. She swept it east, west, northwest, back to northwest. The canopy swallowed heat. She got fragments, patches of warmth from wildlife, from wet vegetation, from ambient temperature differential, and nothing that resolved into a human profile. Nothing. She hadn't fired. She was certain of that the way you're certain of your own heartbeat. Her finger had not been on the trigger. Her scope had been on the corridor. Someone else had shot from inside or adjacent to the perimeter. She swept again. The northwest quadrant, the sector where the wildlife had gone quiet 2 hours ago. She was looking for micro signs, a branch under compressed weight, a canopy displacement from muzzle gas, a heat signature from a suppressor cycling down. There, 800 meters, the relay tower, not a thermal signature, a reflection. That broken solar panel angled in the rain, catching ambient light and throwing it wrong, throwing it directed, at a fixed angle, straight toward her position. Consistent with an optic, consistent with a scope. She held on it for 3 seconds. The reflection held back. Someone on that tower was watching her scope as she watched them. The radio continued its chaos. She heard a name, Major Alan Pryor. She didn't know Pryor well. He'd arrived 6 weeks ago, attached to the logistics oversight function. He'd been running an internal audit. She knew that much because Mercer had mentioned it with the careful absence of inflection he used when something mattered. She keyed the channel. Mercer. I heard. His voice was controlled but stripped of its usual ease. Pryor was the auditor. Yes. I didn't fire. I know. There's an optic on the relay tower. A long silence. Long enough that she counted it. 8 seconds. Don't move your position, he said finally. Don't engage. I need to make some calls. The shot came from... I know where it came from, his voice dropped. That's the problem. She pulled her eye from the scope. The rain came down. The corridor below was empty. The relay tower sat on its ridge, dark and overgrown, with that one broken panel catching light at its precise, deliberate angle. The mission had just become something else. She stayed in position. Training held you in place when instinct told you to move. And instinct told her to move, to descend, to get to the compound, to find out what was happening. But descending in daylight with a known observer on the tower was precisely what an observer would want her to do. A sniper who revealed their position during a crisis was still maintaining control of that revelation. They'd chosen to be seen only indirectly, only partially, only by her. That was a communication. She wasn't going to answer it on their terms. So she stayed. And she watched. The psychology of sniper-on-sniper observation was a particular discipline. Most people, when they thought about snipers, thought about the shot. The shot was the last 5%. The first 95% was this: reading micro signs, tracking behavioral patterns, building a model of the opposing mind. She had the reflection. That told her position, roughly. It told her the observer had chosen a fixed platform rather than a moving one, which told her they'd been in position long enough to establish it, which told her this was planned rather than opportunistic. It told her they'd let her see the reflection. That was a decision. Someone who didn't want to be seen would have masked the panel. It wasn't difficult. A strip of fabric, a repositioned piece of debris. The panel had been left functional because it served a purpose. The purpose was acknowledgement. I see you. I want you to know I see you. She filed this, returned to the scope, began working the perimeter of the tower platform, looking for additional indicators, stabilization evidence, a bipod mark, a disturbed vine line, any sign of extended occupation. At 19:02, a bird landed on the tower's east edge and immediately departed. The departure was wrong, not alarmed, just redirected, as if it had encountered an obstacle that wasn't visual. A human shape, a smell, a heat differential. East edge. She reoriented. Nothing visible, but the bird had been certain. East edge, elevated, which from the tower geometry meant a clear sight line to both the compound entrance and her position simultaneously. A dual observation point. Whoever was up there was monitoring 2 sectors at once, which meant either a 2-person team or a single operator with exceptional situational awareness and a very clear mission brief. She thought about the shot on Pryor. Suppressed, heavy caliber, long range from the tower through jungle, in rain, mid-sentence during a known meeting. That wasn't opportunistic marksmanship. That was a scheduled execution, which meant Shadow, if Shadow and the tower operator were the same, had been inside their intelligence feed, had known the meeting time, had known Pryor would be at the briefing table. She keyed her radio. Mercer, go. Pryor's meeting schedule. Who had access? The silence that followed was exactly the kind of silence that answered questions. She held on the tower. The reflection had gone now, too dark, too much rain. But she could still map the geometry in her head. 800 meters, elevated. The tower had 3 functional platforms. She'd noted them during her morning scan, filed them as structural features of an abandoned structure. Now she reread them as tactical positions. Platform 1, ground level, partially collapsed. No useful angle. Platform 2, midpoint, roughly 15 meters up. Partial sightline to compound. Limited by canopy overgrowth on the southern face. Platform 3, top level, 22 meters. Clear sightline if the canopy had been selectively trimmed. She thought about that. Trimmed how recently, and by whom? You didn't maintain an observation post without maintenance. Selectively clearing vegetation from a platform 22 meters up a deteriorating tower in active jungle wasn't a casual operation. Someone had been there before tonight, maybe long before tonight, which meant Shadow, the constructed threat, the engineered profile, had a fixed address. And someone had built it there deliberately within 800 meters of her scope, positioned to watch the outpost, and had left just enough of a reflection to be found by someone with her particular skill set. She didn't believe in coincidence at range. She keyed her radio again. Mercer, go. Pryor's meeting schedule, who had access? The silence that followed was exactly the kind of silence that answered questions. Mercer came to her position at 2,100. He came the long way, the route that added 40 minutes and crossed the water feature, and he came without his radio, which meant he'd left it behind on purpose. He settled into the hide beside her with the ease of a man who had spent years in exactly this kind of place, read the scope setup without comment, and then sat with his back against the support tree and looked at the dark. Pryor was running a financial trace, he said, not part of his official brief. He was doing it off the books, pulling data he wasn't authorized to access. What data? Fuel allocation records, contractor invoicing, payment routes through 3 shell entities that resolved to a company called Meridian Logistics Solutions. He paused. Meridian has 2 contracts with this task force, both legitimate on paper, both significantly overpaid against delivery. How significantly? 11 million over 14 months. She let that sit. The money exits through Meridian into a secondary entity, Mercer continued, and from there it enters fuel purchase records for trucks operating in the corridor. Cartel corridor. The cartel gets subsidized fuel logistics. We pay for it. And when someone starts tracing it, they get shot. His voice carried no emotion. That was the worst part, not that it surprised him. Pryor was the 3rd auditor assigned to this task force in 18 months. The first 2 were reassigned under different pretexts before they got far enough to see the pattern. Evelyn kept her eyes on the tower. The sniper, Shadow. Not cartel, he said it simply. The insurgent sniper profile in the briefing. The 3 incidents, the Colombian soldier, the contractor vehicle. I've been going back through the reports. The incidents are real, but the interpretation is engineered. Someone wrote the Shadow profile to create a threat that justified this outpost mandate, justified the contractor presence, justified the ROE that keeps our patrols away from the corridor. And the shooter on the tower? Mercer was quiet for a moment. I don't know who they work for, but they shot Pryor, not one of ours, not a patrol, not a mission-critical asset. They shot the one man who was about to surface evidence. She thought about the reflection, about the bird on the east edge, about the deliberate visibility of being seen. "That sniper let me see them," she said. "I know." "Why would they do that?" Mercer turned to look at her in the darkness. His face was hard to read. "Because they want you to know there's a sniper on that tower, before anyone else tells you what's on that tower." He paused. "Before Hayes tells you." She understood then. The briefing tomorrow. The new mission tasking that would inevitably come after tonight's shooting. The order to engage Shadow. The order that would point her scope at the tower. She wasn't being deployed to hunt a threat. She was being deployed to eliminate a witness. "We need to figure out who that shooter is," she said, "before anyone gives me an order." "Yes," Mercer said. He looked old in the jungle dark. Not tired, something more specific than tired. The particular weight of a man who had been right about things too many times and had run out of satisfaction in being right. "Yes, we do." The rain came down. The tower held its position on the ridge, patient and deliberate, its broken panel dark now in the night. And somewhere in the canopy above it, something waited with a scope trained on exactly the right angle to watch her watching it. The resupply drone never arrived. Evelyn had been tracking its scheduled flight path on her wrist-mounted GPS overlay, a small amber indicator moving southeast along Corridor Bravo, due to reach her position at 0630. She'd been watching it for 40 minutes. At 0612, it had dropped off the tracker entirely. Not landed, dropped. The signal had ceased mid-trajectory. She keyed Mercer's channel. "Drones down." "I know." His voice was tight in a way she hadn't heard before. "Shot down over grid 467. Colombian military recovered debris. 50 caliber impact through the airframe." Shadow? Or someone who wants us to think so? She absorbed this. The drone had been carrying 3 days of field rations, 2 battery packs for her thermal scope, and a replacement radio. Without the batteries, her thermal was on borrowed time, maybe 16 hours at current usage rates before degradation set in. Without the replacement radio, the encrypted channel was her only comms link, and it was already compromised by the jamming she'd cataloged yesterday. "What about the comms blackout?" she said. "Extending. I've requested a satellite window through Howard, but the request is being routed through Hayes' office for authorization." A pause. "He hasn't signed it." She let that sit for 3 seconds. Hayes controlled their satellite access. Hayes was not signing the authorization. The blackout was therefore not a technical problem. It was a policy decision. "I need to move position," she said. "Current hide is in their sightline if they're on that tower. I need higher ground and a different axis." "Agreed, but Evelyn..." He stopped. "Say it. Moving means exposure. If there's a second shooter we haven't identified, or if the tower operator has thermal, if I stay here, I'm static in a compromised position with declining equipment." She was already reading the terrain in her head. The canopy offered 3 possible relocation routes. Only one kept her out of potential sightlines from the tower, while also giving her a viable observation angle on the corridor. It involved a ridge traverse that would take 90 minutes minimum and required crossing a gap where the canopy thinned to nothing for 8 meters. 8 meters of open sky, long enough to be seen. "I'll go at 0930, she said. "Rain's heaviest then. Thermal degradation peaks. Best window." Mercer was quiet for a moment. "Copy that. I'll monitor from my end. If I lose your signal for more than 12 minutes, I'll assume contact." "If you lose my signal for more than 12 minutes, assume I'm moving, not compromised. Give me 20 before you escalate." 20, he said. "Be careful." She began her pre-movement checks. Ammo. She had 4 magazines of .300 Norma Magnum, 60 rounds, plus a sidearm with 2 spare magazines. Water. 2 liters in the bladder, 1 backup bottle. Medical kit. Full, minus 2 trauma dressings she'd used on a blister that had gone septic in the humidity, and required monitoring. Food, 2 days at reduced consumption, 3 at emergency ration. The battery readout on her thermal read 63%. She logged the number, watched it as if watching it could slow the draw. Without the replacement batteries, she was looking at roughly 14 hours of thermal capability before degradation rendered it unreliable. In a jungle counter-sniper scenario, thermal was the difference between having a chance and being effectively blind at night. She'd been assuming she'd have it for the full operation. That assumption was now gone. She ran the math. At current usage, scope active approximately 8 hours per day, power management protocols on, she'd have roughly 1.5 days of usable thermal. After that, she was operating on ambient light and pattern recognition in a canopy environment that reduced both to near zero after 2,100 hours. She needed to close this operation faster than she'd planned. At 0847, the jamming started again. This time it ran for 14 seconds, not 6. The duration was increasing, which meant either the operator was getting more confident or they were testing a boundary, probing how much interference she could absorb before she had to react. She didn't react, she logged it, added it to the accumulating picture. At 0921, she began moving. The rain at 0930 was exactly what she'd predicted. A sustained downpour that compressed visibility to 40 meters and drowned ambient sound to a white noise roar. She moved through it with the disciplined economy of someone who had trained for exactly this. 3 points of contact at all times, weight distributed, no step committed until the previous step was confirmed stable. The mud was the primary threat, not the sightlines, not the rain, not the distance, the mud. It was the particular reddish clay-dominant mud of the Darién borderland, which had a consistency that shifted unpredictably between firm and semi-liquid, depending on micro-variations in substrate. She'd read about it in the survey Mercer had sent. She'd categorized it as background information. Now it was the dominant tactical reality. Her left boot went into the ankle on her third step. She froze, assessed, extracted it slowly, pulling straight up, keeping her upper body rigid to avoid creating a torque that would deepen the suction. The boot came free with a sound like a seal breaking. She marked the spot mentally. Too soft, avoid on return, and adjusted her route 2 meters east. 90-minute traverse became 112 minutes. She reached the new position at 1022, a natural depression in the ridge where 2 exposed root systems had grown into a latticework that provided both concealment and a stable firing platform. Better angle to the corridor, worse angle to the tower, which was now partially occluded by an intervening canopy ridge. She worked the scope across her new sector. The corridor was empty. The tower was a partial profile at the far edge of her field of view. She could see the upper platform, but not the lower 2. Good enough for observation, not good enough for engagement. She filed this, noted the trade-off, chose observation over engagement for now, because she still didn't know what she was engaging. At 1140, she found the rival sniper's previous position. It was in the mid-canopy of a ceiba tree, 70 meters south of the tower, at an angle she wouldn't have detected from her morning hide. The signs were sparse and deliberate. A single vine guideline, recently cut, indicating a way-up route. 2 compression marks on a branch crotch, consistent with bipod feet. And, this was the detail that stopped her, a single leaf, turned face down and wedged under a bark ridge. Not fallen, placed. A marker. A marker placed where she, specifically, with her trajectory and her new position angle, would see it. The rival sniper had known she'd move, had predicted the route, had left a breadcrumb. She stared at that turned leaf for 20 seconds. I'm showing you where I was. I'm telling you I'm not there anymore. I'm telling you I know where you are. She swept the surrounding canopy. 30 seconds of methodical, sector-by-sector analysis. Nothing resolved into a human profile. But she caught it on the third pass. A canopy platform, 40 meters northeast of the Saba, constructed from living branches, bent and woven rather than cut, invisible from below. From her angle, at this precise elevation, barely a shape, a thickening of the green that was 2 to 3 degrees too regular to be natural. He'd moved to a third position. Not the tower, not the Saba, a purpose-built blind, constructed in advance, which meant he'd been planning these moves before the operation started. She thought about that. He was operating at least 3 hides, rotating between them on a cycle she hadn't yet mapped. That was the behavior of an operator with time and preparation. Not a cartel associate, not an improvised threat. That was training. That was patience. That was someone who had built this operation the way she built operations. Her shoulder ached where she'd caught a vine whip during the traverse. She ignored it, kept her eye on the canopy platform. The platform didn't move. The platform didn't betray warmth or shape or breath. But she knew it was occupied the way she knew certain things at distance. Not from data, but from the accumulated weight of pattern, the particular quality of stillness that was different from absence. He was watching her watch him. She held steady, controlled her breathing, waited. At 12:03, a small bird landed on the platform edge and sat there for 11 seconds before departing. Not alarmed, comfortable. The platform had been empty long enough for local wildlife to categorize it as harmless. At least 3 hours, probably more. He'd been gone since before she arrived, and he'd left the turned leaf precisely where she'd find it when she was exactly here. The level of anticipation in that was not comfortable to think about. She pulled back from the scope, sat against the root system, let herself actually think, which was a thing you rationed carefully in the field, because thinking meant some fraction of attention was off the environment and on the inside of your own skull, which was a vulnerability. But she needed to think. She built a profile in her head the way her training had taught her. Not assumptions, data points. Data point 1, he'd been operating in this sector for at least 3 weeks. The prior incidents, the Colombian soldier's graze, the contractor vehicle, the patrol contact, were real events. He'd been present and active before she arrived. Data point 2, his hides were pre-constructed. The canopy platform wasn't improvised. It required days of careful work, bending living branches without severing them to avoid browning, weaving the structure in a way that didn't disturb the existing canopy profile. You didn't build that under time pressure. He'd been here long enough to construct it at leisure. Data point 3, he spoke American English with no regional marker. Not cartel, not Colombian military. American civilian or military, current or former. Data point 4, he'd shot prior. A precision shot, planned, executed at range, through jungle, in rain. That was a professional act. But in the 2 days since Pryor's death, he hadn't fired again. He'd had opportunities. She'd been observable at transition points during both her hide moves. He'd chosen not to take them. Data point 5, he was communicating. Not through official channels, not through any system that could be logged or traced. Through the oldest language in the field, presence, position, sign, and now an explicit verbal transmission on a compromised frequency. He was talking to her the only way available while both of them were inside a system that would classify that communication as fraternization with a hostile. She built a hypothesis from those data points and immediately tested it against disconfirming evidence. Hypothesis: he was not an adversary, he was a parallel actor, operating under different tasking with a similar mission objective, exposing the corruption, but from a different institutional origin. A DoD investigator, an FBI asset, a contractor intelligence operative with an actual mandate rather than a compromised one. Someone who had been here long enough to understand the system and had chosen to make contact with her specifically because she was the element within the task force most likely to be useful. Disconfirming evidence. He shot Pryor. She held that contradiction for a long time, because it was real. Pryor had been the auditor, the man tracing the money. If the rival operator was on the right side, shooting Pryor made no sense. Unless Pryor hadn't been on the right side. She filed that, marked it uncertain. It was a significant uncertainty. She wasn't going to resolve it from a canopy position in Darién province. She needed more information, and the only person who had more information was somewhere in this jungle, running 3 hides on a rotation schedule she hadn't yet cracked. She went back to the scope, went back to work. At 1340, the civilians appeared, 7 of them, moving single file along the corridor's eastern margin. Men and women both, ages difficult to assess at distance, but ranging from what looked like late teens to mid-50s. Carrying loads, bundles on backs, one pushing a handcart, moving with the practiced economy of people who walk this route regularly, not hurrying, not watching the canopy. She tracked them on scope, checked them twice. Civilians in a designated red zone. The rules of engagement were unambiguous. No engagement with non-combatants, mandatory reporting of civilian presence in restricted areas, hold fire until threat positive ID confirmed. She keyed her radio. Mercer, 7 civilians in the corridor, grid 491, eastern margin, moving south. A pause. Copy. I see them on the ground sensor feed. They've been using this route for... A longer pause. Evelyn, they've been using this route for at least 3 weeks. There are 14 prior detections in the logs. Why wasn't this reported? It was reported. His voice carried something careful in it. The report was filed. No action taken. She watched the civilians through her scope. The man at the front of the line was carrying a plastic container, 20 liters, she estimated, from the way it pulled at his shoulder. Behind him, a woman with 2 smaller containers in a yoke arrangement across her shoulders. The handcart in the middle of the line carried stacked fuel canisters. Fuel. She thought about the 11 million, about the subsidized logistics, about a cartel that needed fuel to move product through the corridor, and a task force that was officially present to stop them, and the particular geometry of how you made those 2 things coexist. You used civilians. You put the logistics on civilian backs. You made the corridor functionally unengageable by introducing civilian presence, which meant any enforcement action risked non-combatant harm, which meant any enforcement action required additional authorization, which meant nothing happened. They're carrying fuel, she said. Yes. For the corridor. That would be my assessment. She watched the line of people move through her scope. They weren't combatants. They were people who had been given a job that paid money in a place where money was scarce, and the origin of the fuel and the destination of the fuel were probably not their concern, because concern required options, and options required circumstances that these people did not have. She could not fire into that line. She would not. But watching them move through her scope, watching the fuel canisters on the handcart, she felt the particular frustration of understanding a system you could not disrupt through the tools you'd been given. The civilians cleared the sector at 1417. She logged the sighting, sent it to Mercer. Mercer filed it. The corridor resumed its silence. At 1502, the canopy platform showed movement. She was on it in under 2 seconds. A shape, briefly, unmistakably, shifted in the woven branches. Not a bird, not wind. Deliberate repositioning, slow and controlled. The movement of someone who knew they were potentially observable and was managing their exposure. Then stillness. 1 second of exposure. Enough. The operator was back. And they'd let her see the return. Mercer's call came at 1634. His voice was level. That was how she knew it was bad. My access has been revoked, he said. Effective 1 hour ago. All contractor intelligence liaison credentials suspended pending review. She held her breath for 1 second. What grounds? Unauthorized access to logistics audit files, specifically Pryor's working documents. A pause. I did access those files. I accessed them because they were relevant to your mission and to an active corruption investigation. That's within my liaison mandate. Someone disagrees. Hayes. The request came from Hayes's office. The formal order came from Task Force J2. J2 was the intelligence directorate, above Hayes. Whoever had made this happen had reached beyond the outpost. My contract is being reviewed for termination. I've been told to cease all communication with field personnel pending the review. You're calling me anyway. I'm calling you because this is my last authorized window. After this call, they'll pull my encrypted channel access. A brief pause. I need you to understand what this means for your extraction. She already understood. She said it anyway. If I need extraction, I go through Hayes. Yes, and Hayes may not authorize it, or may authorize it under conditions that serve his interests rather than yours. He stopped. She could hear him breathing. There's a protocol. If you need emergency extraction, you bypass the task force chain and contact the aviation unit directly. Call sign is Ironwood. Frequency is on the backup channel list I sent you 4 days ago. She had it memorized. Copy. I've also sent everything I have on Meridian Logistics, the full file, everything I could pull before access cut off, to a DOD IG investigator, a woman named Caldwell. She's in Fort Meade. She's legitimate. The problem is this takes time, and time is what you don't have. How long? Days, maybe weeks. The IG process has to verify the data, establish jurisdiction, determine whether to bring in criminal investigation. He paused again, longer this time. Evelyn. Yeah, they know you've been talking to me. Whatever orders come through that channel, assume they're colored by that knowledge. He stopped. She could hear him making a decision. I'm not going to be able to reach you after this call, not through official channels. Understood. There's a second option, he said. If you can get physical evidence, hard media, something that can't be dismissed as a fabricated signal intercept, the IG investigation moves faster. Physical evidence means raid authority. It means the channel cut. Not static, not degradation, a clean cut, the kind that happened when access was revoked mid-transmission. She pulled the radio from her ear, looked at it, put it back. She was now operating without intelligence support, without a clear extraction path, and with an operator in the field who was 2 steps ahead of her planning. The situation had moved from complex to untenable in the space of 20 minutes. She let herself feel it for exactly 30 seconds. This was a practice she developed in Iraq. You gave emotion its 30 seconds, and then you put it somewhere else and operated. Not suppression. Suppression created pressure that found exits at the wrong moments. This was more like triage. You matter, but not right now. What she felt in those 30 seconds was something close to grief. Not for herself, for Mercer. 62 years old, a decorated career, a decade of post-retirement service in roles that asked him to navigate systems he found increasingly corrupt and asked him to do it with his name attached. He'd found another hill. He'd chosen to climb it. And now the system that hill was inside had revoked his ability to climb, had stripped his credentials, had filed a review that would be used to discredit anything he'd already sent to Fort Meade before the access cut. She thought about what he'd said in Djibouti after the Killbox op. Experience is just pattern recognition with a lot of failures attached. He'd said it without self-pity, without bitterness, a statement of fact. He'd been wrong enough times that the information value of being wrong had become as useful to him as the information value of being right. She hoped he'd gotten the file to Caldwell before the access cut. She hoped Caldwell was real and competent and in a position to act. She had no way to verify any of those things. She had 30 seconds of emotion, And then she had the mission. The 30 seconds ended. She thought about what Mercer had said before the cut. Physical evidence. Not a data burst, not a signal intercept, something you could hold. She thought about the relay tower, the platform, the infrastructure that was broadcasting false insurgent signals to justify this operation. If the tower had hard media, a server, a drive, a physical data source, that was evidence. That was the kind of thing a raid authorization could be built on. She just had to get to it without being shot. She spotted the child at 1742, a boy she estimated 8 or 9 years old, emerging from the tree line at the corridor's edge, probably from the same village group that had passed through at 1340. He was moving towards something on the ground, a piece of equipment or debris she couldn't fully resolve from her angle. He was small. He was in the corridor. He was, by every calculation, somewhere he should not be. And at 1743, she had the rival sniper in her scope for the first time. He'd made a mistake. Small. The kind of mistake you made at hour 11 of a position, when focus began to aggregate fatigue and you let your weapon angle drift 2 degrees off the sightline axis you'd been holding. He was in the canopy platform, and the angle correction he made was enough, just enough at her distance, with her magnification, to create a brief barrel reflection. It lasted 0.8 seconds. She was certain of the shape. Long barrel, suppressed, human hands. A profile that was not consistent with cartel equipment. It was military grade, well maintained, the brief flash of it carrying the particular character of a rifle that had been taken care of for a long time. She had the shot. 312 meters. Angle adjusted for elevation differential, wind from southwest at 6 knots, humidity compensation calculated, breathing cycle at its pause, trigger at first stage. The boy crossed into her line of fire. She didn't fire. The boy was in the line of fire for 2 seconds. She held through both of them because she wasn't going to fire anyway. Because even if he hadn't been there, she wasn't sure she was going to fire. Because the question of who this operator was and what they were doing and why they had been leaving her breadcrumbs was still open. And you didn't close open questions with a shot you couldn't take back. But she didn't move the rifle. She tracked. She held. And then the shot came from inside the canopy platform. She heard the suppressed crack, felt the physical signature of a round passing within proximity, and something hit her left shoulder. Not a round, not a direct hit, a ricochet fragment, or a wood splinter driven by a round that had been aimed slightly wide, striking a branch in her forecover and driving debris into her position. She rolled left, hard, behind the root system. The fragment had opened a 4-centimeter gash across the top of her shoulder muscle. Not deep, not arterial, painful with the specific, sharp quality of a fresh cut that would become worse as adrenaline faded. She pressed her hand to it, felt blood, not a flood but steady. Applied pressure with the trauma dressing she'd already had in her vest pocket, because in this kind of terrain you kept dressings accessible. She breathed, 3 counts in, 3 counts out. The pain was specific and manageable. She cataloged it the way she cataloged everything, not suppressing it, just assigning it a category. Functional injury, monitor, do not prioritize. Her left arm had full mobility. The shoulder muscle group was intact. She could feel that in the range of motion when she tested it, careful and deliberate. The gash was cosmetic in the tactical sense. It would slow her on technical climbs and reduce her ability to hold steady through extended scope sessions. But it was not going to kill her in the next 48 hours. She held the dressing. Breathed. He'd fired. He'd fired slightly wide. Deliberately or not, she didn't know. The result was a graze on her shoulder instead of a round through her thorax. She thought about the deliberate question very carefully. A sniper who had anticipated her route, predicted her position, left her breadcrumbs, and held through multiple observation cycles. A sniper with that level of operational control did not accidentally fire slightly wide at 300 meters under manageable conditions. The wind was 6 knots. The range was well within precision capability. She'd had him in her scope, and he'd had her in his. He'd chosen to miss. She didn't know what to do with that. Her hide was burned. The shot, even suppressed, even absorbed by rain, created a displacement signature she couldn't recover from. The fragment debris that had hit her would have created secondary movement in her concealment. If he'd been watching before firing, and he had been, she was certain of that, he'd now mapped her exact position. She had to move. Immediately. Daylight was fading but not gone, and moving in transitional light was its own risk calculus. She pulled back from the root system using a backward roll that kept her profile below the vegetation line, came up in a crouch against the ridge face, and moved northeast along the terrain contour she'd scouted during her morning traverse. 30 meters. 40. The shoulder was bleeding through the dressing. She could feel the warmth of it, but not at a rate that would impair function for the next critical window. She found a secondary depression, less ideal than the first, cramped between two exposed boulders with limited overhead cover. She settled into it, pulled her secondary scope, a compact spotting glass, non-thermal, and glassed the sector behind her. Nothing followed. She steadied her breathing, checked the shoulder. The dressing had slowed the bleed. She pressed harder, held for 60 seconds, felt the flow diminish to seepage. Not ideal, not dangerous. At 1804, the radio, the primary encrypted channel, produced 3 brief pulses of static in a specific rhythm. Short, long, short, 3 times in sequence. Not weather, not terrain, not jamming, a code. She'd never discussed code signals with a rival sniper. There was no reason she should have. She'd never communicated with him at all. Not directly, not explicitly. But she knew Morse code the way every serious field operator knew it. And the rhythm of those 3 pulses, short, long, short, short, long, short, short, long, short, was a letter. Repeated. R, R, R. She stared at the radio, turned it in her hand. R could mean dozens of things, could mean received, could mean a call sign, could mean nothing if it was interference. She didn't believe it was interference. Then, across the same channel, at a signal strength that suggested the transmitter was close, within 400 meters, possibly less, a voice. One sentence, delivered without inflection, without introduction, in the particular flat register of someone who had rehearsed it and was delivering it precisely. "You're guarding the wrong side." The channel went silent. She held the radio for 7 seconds without moving. The voice had been male. American accent, no strong regional marker. Calm. Not a threat, not a challenge. A statement of fact delivered as a courtesy. The kind of thing you told someone before a situation required them to figure it out themselves under worse conditions. She thought about the deliberate miss, the breadcrumbs, the relay tower left operational long enough to be found, the moved face-down leaf. He wasn't hunting her. He was trying to talk to her. Through the only language available in this jungle, through scope reflections and displaced vegetation, in a single sentence on a compromised channel, he was trying to establish contact. She thought about Hayes, about Mercer's revoked access, about the civilians with fuel canisters, about Pryor bleeding out in the briefing room. She thought about the relay tower on the ridge above the fractured shale. She keyed the channel, said nothing, pressed transmit twice, released, short, short, in Morse, I. She stared at the radio for a long moment after. "You're guarding the wrong side." The statement sat in her chest with a physical weight. Not because it was new information. She'd been building toward that conclusion for 30 hours, from the fuel allocation numbers to the stage signal traffic to Hayes's unsigned authorization request. But because hearing it spoken in that flat, deliberate register by a voice that was clearly American and clearly professional, and clearly not affiliated with anyone currently trying to help her, It converted a hypothesis into a shared reality. Someone else knew. Someone else had been here long enough to document it, and they had chosen her specifically to communicate it to. She thought about why. She was the sniper element. She was the field asset with the clearest shot at the rival operator. The asset Hayes was relying on to close the loop. If she was the tool being used for the kill, then she was also, from the rival operator's perspective, the tool closest to the mechanism. The one with the most leverage in the immediate situation, if that leverage could be redirected. She also thought about the fact that she was a staff sergeant with 6 years of service, 2 combat deployments, and no institutional protection. She wasn't a JAG officer. She wasn't an IG investigator. She wasn't a senator's aide or a congressional staffer with oversight authority. She was a field soldier in a jungle in Colombia with a rifle, a stolen evidence drive, and a superior officer who had just labeled her compromised. Whatever this operator had planned, whatever play he was making, she was the most useful and most expendable piece on the board. She didn't lose sight of that. Useful and expendable often occupied the same space. But she also had the drive, and she had the open question about prior, and she had 40 hours of pattern data on a rival operator who had, by any reasonable assessment, gone to significant lengths not to kill her when killing her would have been straightforward. She put the radio in her vest pocket, began working toward the tower. Then she stopped. She turned back to the sector where the radio transmission had originated. The bearing, the estimated signal strength, the triangulation she'd worked in her head as he spoke. She mapped it against the terrain she'd been building in memory for 2 days. The bearing resolved to a position approximately 200 meters northwest of her current location. Inside the canopy, below the ridgeline, he was close. Had been close when he transmitted. He was telling her where to go, but he was also telling her where he was. Either he trusted her more than was warranted at this stage, or he was entirely confident she couldn't close that distance before he moved. She chose to take the tower route anyway. It was the right call regardless of what else was in play. Physical evidence first, everything else second. Then she put the radio away and began working toward the tower. She reached the base of the tower ridge at 2031. 45 minutes of movement through post-dusk jungle, navigating by GPS in memory, and the particular skill set that came from doing this in 3 different countries over 6 years. The rain had eased to a mist that reduced visibility, but also reduced acoustic signature. Her footfalls were absorbed, the squelch of mud muffled. The ridge approach was the problem. The eastern face, the one Mercer had flagged in his geology notes, was steep and unstable, clay over fractured shale, the kind of slope that held under normal conditions and failed catastrophically when saturated. 3 days of rain had saturated it thoroughly. She could feel it underfoot at the base. The substrate had the particular softness of material that had absorbed more water than it could express. She went up the western face instead, slower, more exposed, but stable. The tower base was older than it had looked from distance. Corroded hardware, concrete footings cracked by root intrusion, the access ladder's lower rungs missing entirely. She had to jump for the 4th rung, catch it one-handed, haul up with her good arm while the wounded shoulder protested in language she categorized and filed away. Platform 2. She cleared it in 60 seconds. Equipment she hadn't expected, a junction box, hardwired, running cable in 3 directions. She traced them with a tactical light filtered red. One cable ran to the solar array on the roof. One ran to an antenna cluster pointed south, toward the corridor. The third ran down, into the tower base structure, towards something underground. She followed the third cable. It ended at a weatherproof case, military-grade, olive drab, padlocked. She cut the lock with her multi-tool, opened the case, a signal relay server, compact, hardened, running on a battery backup system that had clearly been recently serviced. The battery cells were new, still showing manufacturer dates within the last 4 months. The server had 2 external drives attached via hardwired connection. Both drives were active, status lights indicating live operation. She read the configuration panel. The server was broadcasting on 3 frequencies she recognized as insurgent monitoring bands. The signal pattern was programmed, pre-recorded traffic, looping, designed to mimic the communications signature of an active cell operating in the corridor. There was no active cell. There had never been an active cell. The server was generating fake insurgent signal traffic to justify the task force's continued presence in this sector. She pulled one of the external drives, pocketed it. The server remained operational. She didn't want to trigger any dead man alert by powering it down. She climbed back to platform 2. Thought. Physical evidence. This was it. A drive containing the programmed fake signal traffic with configuration data that would show origin, programming date, setup parameters. Enough for the IG investigator. Maybe enough for a federal warrant. But evidence needed to get out of this jungle, and her extraction path ran through haze. She thought about what Mercer had said about physical evidence accelerating the IG timeline. She thought about the drive in her pocket. She thought about the tower base, sitting on a saturated clay-over-shale slope that Mercer had described as, his word, a decision point. She climbed to the roof, checked the solar array, checked the equipment enclosure that housed the relay broadcast hardware, looked at the ridge below her. 40 meters of steep, water-saturated slope. At its base, the main corridor access road, the route the contractor convoy would use. She'd seen convoy movement on that route twice in the past 36 hours. The convoy that had come in on the wrong axis. The one with the anomalous fuel allocation. If the tower came down, not just powered off, but structurally came down, it would take the relay server with it. No more fake signal traffic. No more pretextual insurgent presence. And if it came down onto that slope, in the current saturation conditions, she thought about fractured shale and clay substrate and 3 days of rain. Then she heard the order come through on the primary channel. Hayes' voice, no preamble. Cross, this is actual. Priority mission update. Shadow has been positively identified. Engage and eliminate on positive visual confirmation. Authorization is live. She stood on the tower roof in the dark, in the mist, with a stolen evidence drive in her pocket, and a clean shot she hadn't taken, and a single sentence on a radio channel still cycling in her memory. You're guarding the wrong side. She had the shot at 2107. He'd returned to the canopy platform. She could see it now from the tower roof. A slightly different angle than before. His position resolving at 240 meters with the scope on high magnification. He wasn't moving. He was watching the corridor below, a different sector than his previous orientation. Either he'd identified a new target or he was tracking the convoy. She thought it was the convoy. She steadied, went through the calculation. Wind negligible at this range. Elevation slight but manageable. Target partially obscured by the platform weave, but with a viable window through the southwestern gap. She could take this shot. She had taken harder shots. Hayes' order was live. Positive ID confirmed. She had him in scope. She could see the rifle. The silhouette matched the profile she'd been building across 40 hours of observation. By every procedural standard, this was a lawful engagement under active orders. Her finger rested on the trigger guard. Not the trigger, the guard. She thought about the turned leaf, the breadcrumbs, the deliberate miss. She thought about Pryor very carefully. Pryor was the auditor. Pryor was dead. If the rival operator was working the same side of this situation, if he was genuinely trying to surface what Meridian was doing, then Pryor's death didn't fit the picture cleanly. You didn't kill the person closest to the evidence you were trying to expose. Unless Pryor wasn't what he appeared to be. Unless there was something in Pryor's audit that the rival operator knew and she didn't. She filed it, marked it uncertain, high consequence, return to later. She didn't have enough to resolve it here. What she had was the tower, the drive, the geological survey. She thought about Mercer's definition of experience, pattern recognition with a lot of failures attached. She thought about Djibouti in the kill box and the 40 minutes he'd been right before the intelligence confirmed it. She thought about the way he'd said, "This becomes a decision point," not "this is wrong," or "don't do it," or "be careful." A decision point. He'd named it correctly. He'd left the decision to her. She thought about what she'd been deployed here to do. Not eliminate a threat. Eliminate a witness. If she took this shot, the relay tower kept running. The fake signal traffic kept broadcasting. The contractor convoy kept moving product. Hayes filed a clean after-action report. Insurgent sniper eliminated. Operation successful. No further anomalies. And the drive in her pocket, even if she got it out, was easier to dismiss without the tower as corroborating physical evidence. If she didn't take this shot, she was in direct violation of a lawful order from a superior officer. That was the end of her career, and potentially the beginning of a court-martial. And there was a version of events in which Hayes and the people above him used that violation to bury everything else. And there was a third option, the one she'd been thinking about since she read the geological survey. The generator for the relay server was housed in the equipment enclosure on the tower's eastern face. She'd confirmed it during her sweep of the platform. It was a diesel unit, 50 gallons capacity, currently full. She checked the gauge. 50 gallons of diesel fuel in a metal enclosure on the eastern face of a tower that sat above 40 meters of water-saturated, clay-over fractured shale slope. If the generator went, if the tower went, she looked at the canopy platform, at the figure in it, watching the corridor, not watching her. He'd positioned himself out of her optimal sightline from the tower. He knew where she was. He knew what order had come through. He was giving her a clear shot at him and simultaneously not occupying the angle from which she'd have to choose between him and the tower. He was giving her the choice. She pulled her rifle from the tower roof position, laid it across the equipment enclosure, looked at the generator housing. One round through the housing would rupture the fuel tank. Diesel required an ignition source. It wouldn't combust from the round itself, but the electrical components of the generator would provide that source. The fire would spread to the server enclosure, then to the tower structure. Aluminum and steel mostly, slow to burn, but the cable runs were rubber-coated copper, and they'd carry fire fast. The collapse would be uncertain. Maybe northeast, maybe due east. She couldn't fully control the direction. But the ridge slope ran consistently east-southeast, and that was the direction of the corridor road. It might hit nothing. It might hit the road. It might trigger a slope failure. The geological survey had said if you disturb the ground at the right point, this was the right point. She sighted on the generator housing, breathed out, made the choice. The round entered the generator housing at the fuel tank interface. The ignition came 3 seconds later. Not an explosion, an ignition. A rapid orange bloom that spread from the housing along the cable runs exactly as she'd calculated. She was already moving, dropping from the tower roof via the access route she'd climbed, hitting the western slope at a controlled slide, putting distance and rock between herself and the structure. The fire reached the server enclosure at approximately 15 seconds. The enclosure held for another 8 before the internal temperature caused the battery backup to fail catastrophically. That failure produced the explosion, contained, directed upward and outward by the enclosure walls, but sufficient to compromise the tower's structural integrity at the midpoint joint. She heard the groan of metal, then the lateral shift. The tower came down on the east face. She'd been right about the slope. Not entirely right. The collapse was more northward than she'd predicted, which meant the primary debris field went wide of the corridor road by 30 meters. But the impact on the saturated slope was what the geological survey had told her it would be. The slope failed. Not dramatically, not all at once. It began as a slow displacement. She could hear it even at her distance, a grinding sound like stone moving on stone. And then it accelerated. The clay substrate, fully saturated, lost cohesion along the fractured shale fault line and began to move. 40 meters of slope, now in motion, carrying debris, vegetation, the remains of the tower, and most critically, the corridor road access point at the base. The first convoy vehicle, she could see it now in the scope as she'd reached the western tree line, caught the leading edge of the debris flow. It wasn't buried, it was blocked. The road was no longer passable. The convoy stopped. The vehicles behind bunched up, shouting in Spanish, visible even at distance as figures exited vehicles and tried to assess the situation. Chaos, but controlled chaos. No one was hurt. She'd calculated for that. She held the scope on the convoy for 30 seconds, watched the figures assess the blockage. One climbed the debris pile, came back down, shaking his head. The convoy wasn't going anywhere tonight. The road wouldn't be cleared in under 6 hours. The debris volume was significant. The equipment they'd need wasn't forward staged, and the terrain around the blockage didn't offer a passable alternate route. One convoy, one night, one fraction of an $11 million operation disrupted. She didn't let herself think it was enough. It wasn't enough. It was a delay, a complication, a message. If the right people were watching, if Caldwell in Fort Meade was moving on Mercer's file, if the IG timeline was accelerated by the physical evidence now in her vest pocket rather than destroyed with the server. If. She logged it, filed it, moved on. Her radio erupted. Cross, what the hell just happened? Cross, respond. Hayes, no pretense of composure now. Cross, did you discharge your weapon? What is that fire? Respond now. She did not respond. She was watching the canopy platform. The figure in it had moved, was moving, dropping from the platform via a route she couldn't fully track. Gone into the canopy. She tracked where she estimated he'd go, held there for 20 seconds, and then he was in the open for just a moment, crossing a gap in the vegetation, running low, moving east, away from the compound, away from the blocked convoy, into the deep jungle. He paused at the gap's edge, turned. She had him in scope, just for a second, just his profile, and he did something she did not expect. He raised one hand, not a weapon, an open hand. Then he was gone. She held the scope on the empty gap for a long time. Behind her, the fire on the collapsed tower was dying down in the rain. The relay server was destroyed. The evidence drive was in her pocket. The corridor road was blocked. Her radio was still broadcasting Hayes' voice, each transmission incrementally more controlled as he reasserted command posture over his own fury. All units, Cross is to be considered compromised. Do not assist field position. Extraction is denied pending review. She is to be detained on return to FOB Sentinel. She lowered the radio, looked at the dark jungle around her, thought about the open hand at the gap edge. She was rogue now, officially compromised. Extraction denied. She was also, for the first time in this operation, certain she was on the right side. The jungle pressed in around her. The rain resumed its constancy. Somewhere in the dark, a figure with a long rifle, in American cadence, and a deliberate miss on his record, was moving through the same jungle in a direction she hadn't yet determined. She needed to find him before Hayes found either of them. The order went out at 2218. She heard it on the primary channel, Hayes reading it in the flat, procedural register of a man who had decided that composure was the most important thing he could project right now. All FOB Sentinel personnel, Staff Sergeant Evelyn Cross is to be considered compromised and potentially hostile. She has destroyed coalition infrastructure, disobeyed direct orders under active engagement authorization, and failed to respond to command communications. She is not to be assisted. Any contact with Cross is to be reported immediately to the J2 duty officer. She listened to it from a position 40 meters inside the western tree line, her back against a root mass, her shoulder dressing soaked through and beginning to stiffen. She applied the last trauma dressing she had from her kit, pressed it firm, held, compromised and potentially hostile. She'd known it was coming. That didn't make it easier to hear. 11 years she'd been inside the uniform, 2 combat deployments, 3 commendations, a record that had earned her this assignment. In 22 words, Hayes had converted all of that into a liability. She thought about what Mercer had told her once, in the context of something else entirely. The institution will always protect itself before it protects you. That's not malice, it's gravity. You have to plan accordingly. She was planning accordingly. She took stock. Shoulder, functional, painful, stable. Ammo, 52 rounds of .300 Norma Magnum, sidearm full. Water, under 1 liter, critical in 12 hours. Thermal, 41%, roughly 10 hours. The evidence drive in her left breast pocket. She checked it twice. She thought about the open hand at the gap edge. East was deeper jungle, the kind of terrain that swallowed people, that required intimate knowledge to navigate at night without thermal. He knew it. He was moving through it, which meant he had a destination. She oriented on her GPS. There was a river crossing at grid 517, not a ford, a crossing. Local knowledge. You only knew about it if you'd been here long enough to find it. She moved east. She heard the helicopter at 0114. Not an approach, a departure. The distinctive thwop of rotor wash receding, moving southwest, already gone by the time she cleared the canopy to a sight angle. Whatever it had carried in had been delivered. She found Mercer at grid 509. He was sitting on a root system with his back to a tree, a compact medical kit open across his knees, applying a pressure bandage to his left forearm with the practiced one-handed competence of someone who had done this before and was not particularly alarmed by the need to do it again. He looked up when she approached. His expression didn't change. "You're late," he said. "You're bleeding." Superficial. The pilot wasn't authorized to land. We did a low hover. I came down the rope faster than ideal. He finished the bandage, closed the kit. "How's the shoulder?" "Manageable." She settled into a crouch across from him. "You're not supposed to be here." "My contract was terminated this afternoon. I'm not here in any official capacity." He looked at her with the creekwater eyes that didn't waste motion. "I'm here as a private citizen who happens to know where you are and has information you need." "How did you know where I was?" "GPS tracker. In the medical kit I packed for your pre-deployment. I put it there in Djibouti." He said it without apology. "I didn't tell you because you'd have removed it." She held that for a moment, then decided she wasn't angry, which told her something about the situation she was in. "Who else has that frequency?" she said. "No one. It's a commercial unit, encrypted. I'm the only reader." He reached into his jacket, produced a satellite phone, small, ruggedized, civilian model. "This is not routed through any task force system. It goes directly to Caldwell at Fort Meade. She received my file. She's confirmed receipt and has opened a preliminary inquiry." "Preliminary, not a raid." "Not yet. She needs corroborating physical evidence to escalate to criminal referral." He looked at her. "Do you have the drive?" She showed him the drive from her breast pocket. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite satisfaction. Something older and less readable than either. "Good," he said simply. Then, "There's something else." He reached into the same jacket pocket, produced a folded sheet, printed, creased carefully, the kind of document you carried because you couldn't risk losing it to a wet phone. He handed it to her. She unfolded it, read it again. It was a personnel record. Name, James Wakefield. Rank, GS-14 DoD, Defense Intelligence Agency. Assignment: Counter-Corruption Task Force, Latin America Division. Status: non-official cover, active deployment. Attached to the record was a photograph. She recognized the build, the equipment profile, the operational posture she'd been cataloging for 2 days. Shadow, she said. His real name is Wakefield. He's DIA. He was deployed to this sector 8 months ago, well before this task force stood up, to investigate Meridian logistics from the outside. He's been building a case independently. Mercer paused. Pryor was Meridian's auditor, not their target, their man. He wasn't tracing the money to expose Meridian. He was running the audit to identify where the evidence trail was weakest and manage the exposure risk. She sat with that for 4 seconds. The prior contradiction resolved. The thing she'd filed as uncertain, high consequence returned to later. Wakefield found out, she said. Wakefield found out. And he made the call that Pryor was more useful removed than operational. Mercer's voice was careful. That's a judgment call I'm not going to defend or condemn in the field. The DIA made a determination. He executed it. And then Hayes used Pryor's death to justify my deployment. Yes, which Wakefield did not anticipate. He didn't expect Hayes to escalate to a counter-sniper asset. He thought the task force would respond administratively, reroute the audit, slow-walk the investigation. When you arrived, he had to revise his approach. She thought about the breadcrumbs, the deliberate visibility, the 800 meters of reflection on a broken solar panel. He was trying to bring me in without compromising either of our positions, she said. Yes, and he succeeded by most measures. Mercer folded the printout back and pocketed it. He knows you have the drive. I made contact with his handler 40 minutes ago. He wants to meet. Where? Grid 517, the river crossing. Mercer began getting to his feet with the particular deliberate care of a 62-year-old man on a root-tangled jungle floor at 0130. He has something you need. Hard copies of the server configuration. He pulled them before you burned the tower. He anticipated you'd burn the tower. He left me a choice. He left you the information you needed to make a choice. Mercer looked at her steadily. There's a difference. He's been very particular about that distinction throughout this operation. She stood, checked her rifle, checked the shoulder, looked east. You shouldn't be in the field, she said. Your arm. My arm is fine, and you need a second set of eyes on your 6 until we get to that crossing. He picked up a compact sidearm she hadn't noticed. A Glock 19, civilian, no task force markings. I didn't come this far to wait in a helicopter. She looked at him for a moment. This man, 62 years old, with a rope-burned forearm and bad coffee in his institutional memory, and a GPS tracker he'd put in her kit in Djibouti because he'd known this day might come. Stay on my left, she said. Watch the canopy. I know how to walk in a jungle, Evelyn. I know you do. She moved east. That's why I want you on my left. Wakefield was at the crossing, crouched at the river's edge, a narrow waterway, 4 meters across, with a rope and plank bridge half submerged but functional. Rifle across his back, not in hand. He watched them approach without moving. Up close, he was older than scope estimate, early 50s, with the leanness of someone who'd been in the field a long time. His face was weathered and calm. He looked at her shoulder. That needs a proper clean. It'll go septic in this humidity if you don't irrigate it. I know. She stopped 6 feet from him. Wakefield. Cross. Then to Mercer. Sir. Don't call me sir, Mercer said. I'm a civilian. Old habits. Wakefield reached into his vest and produced a waterproof envelope. 3 sheets inside, she could see the density of the print through the plastic. Server configuration data, setup parameters, programming dates, the frequency schedule for the fake signal traffic. Cross-reference with Meridian's contract billing periods, The signal traffic ramps up every time Meridian submits an invoice. It's a performance metric. They get paid more when the threat environment justifies increased contractor presence. She took the envelope, examined the sheets through the plastic without opening it. Not distrust, just field discipline, keeping the documents dry. You anticipated I'd destroy the tower. I anticipated you'd make the right call once you had the information. He looked at her with direct, uncomplicated assessment. I've been watching you work for 4 days. You're methodical. You don't make assumptions. You were always going to arrive at the same conclusions I did. I just needed to make sure you arrived at them before Hayes gave you an order you couldn't unwind. You shot Pryor. Yes. Walk me through it. He didn't flinch. Pryor had identified 3 of the 5 evidence threads I was building. He wasn't tracing them to expose them. He was tracing them to close them off, to find the gaps in the documentation and patch them before an external audit could get traction. If he'd completed that work, the Meridian case was dead. 5 years of DIA groundwork, gone. He paused. I made a determination. I don't expect you to agree with it. Do you agree with it? He took 3 seconds. I think it was necessary. I think necessary and right are different words. He looked at the river. I think about it. She filed that. It wasn't the answer she'd have given. It wasn't an answer she found comfortable. But it was an honest answer, and honest answers from field operators in the middle of operations that had long since exceeded their clean parameters were not things she could afford to dismiss. What's your extraction? She said. My handler has a window at 0600 from grid 531. Fixed wing, low signature. I can take both of you. Hayes has a net out. Hayes doesn't know about this crossing. I've been operating in this sector for 8 months. There are 12 approaches to this river he doesn't have mapped. He said it without arrogance. Fact, delivered precisely. His ground teams are covering the 4 primary corridors. We can be at 531 in 3 hours if we move now. She looked at Mercer. He gave her nothing. No recommendation, no nod. Her call. She thought about the drive in her pocket, the configuration sheets in the envelope, the IG investigator in Fort Meade with a preliminary inquiry open, and a phone that connected directly to Mercer's satellite unit. She thought about Hayes, back at FOB Sentinel, filing a report that would label this a successful disruption of an insurgent cell and mention nothing about a relay tower or a convoy or $11 million in contractor payments. She thought about the open hand at the gap edge. We move at 0145, she said. Single file. I'm on point. Wakefield nodded once. Copy that. They made 2 kilometers before the contact. It came from the north, a 3-person ground team moving without lights, following a GPS track rather than terrain features, which told her they were following a programmed route rather than reading the ground. That meant they'd been told where to go, which meant someone at FOB Sentinel had better intelligence on their position than she'd assessed. She went still. Hand signal back to Mercer and Wakefield. Freeze. She swept the north with the thermal. 61% battery. 3 heat signatures, moving in column, 60 meters out and closing. Armed, she could see the thermal profile of rifle barrels. They hadn't seen her yet. They were on a track that would bring them within 20 meters of her position in approximately 90 seconds. She made the calculation. 3 against 3, but Mercer was injured and she'd been awake for 31 hours. A firefight had unpredictable outcomes. She keyed her radio to a civilian GPS coordination channel the ground team would likely be monitoring. Transmitted for 2 seconds. Deliberate interference, nothing identifying, just noise. The column halted. 3 signatures stopping, the front element looking down at a device, the middle going to a knee. Standard response to navigation interruption. She used the 40 seconds they spent recalibrating to move her group 30 meters southwest into a depression below their thermal horizon. The column resumed. past 20 meters north of where they'd been standing. She breathed. "Nice," Wakefield said very quietly. "Don't talk," she said. They moved. At 0318, 1 kilometer from grid 531, the second contact happened. This one was different. A single heat signature, stationary, in a position that suggested deliberate placement. Not a patrol, not a search team, someone waiting. At the exact choke point between their current position and the extraction grid, she stopped. Studied it. The signature was motionless, which was either ambush discipline or someone in a fixed observation post. The position was elevated, a rock outcrop 7 meters up, with clear sight line to the only viable ground-level approach. She read the geometry. The only way through was exposed for 12 meters. 12 meters of open ground under that position at 3:15 in the morning, with a compromised shoulder and a colleague with a rope-burned arm and a DIA officer who'd been in the field for 8 months. She looked at Wakefield. He was already reading the same geometry. "I can take the high approach," he said quietly. "Come around the north face of the outcrop, get above the position. If they're watching their 6, they're watching south. That's the approach they're covering. The north face is blind from where they're sitting." He was certain. She assessed his certainty. He'd been in this sector for 8 months. He knew this terrain the way she'd built her hide knowledge, from sustained, methodical presence. 2 minutes, she said. "If you're not in position in 2 minutes, I create a diversion south." He moved. She watched him go north, disappearing into the tree line, his thermal signature shrinking with distance until it was indistinguishable from background noise. Good discipline, clean movement. 1 minute 40 seconds later, the stationary signature on the outcrop shifted. A sudden reorientation, north-facing, which meant Wakefield had been seen or heard on the north approach. She moved south, broke cover, crossed 6 of the 12 meters before the signature on the outcrop snapped back south, and the shot came. It hit rock 2 feet to her left. Close, the accuracy of someone who'd had to acquire a moving target fast, rather than a pre-aimed shot. She hit the ground, rolled, came up behind a boulder that gave her partial cover and a viable sightline to the outcrop's lower third. She didn't have a clean shot at the shooter. The shooter didn't have a clean shot at her. Stalemate for 3 seconds. Then from the north face of the outcrop, a sound. Brief, definitive. The stalemate ended. The signature on the outcrop went still. Wakefield appeared at the top of the outcrop 8 seconds later. He looked down at her position, raised 2 fingers, 2 count, clear. She stood. The shoulder was bleeding again through the dressing. She pressed her arm against her side and kept moving. "One of Hayes's people," Wakefield said when she reached the base of the outcrop. "Sergeant, not local militia. This is escalating faster than I anticipated." "How far to 531? 800 meters. Then we move." They reached grid 531 at 0401. The extraction point was a narrow clearing, 40 meters of open ground carved by a seasonal water feature that had dried to cracked mud. Enough room for a fixed-wing short takeoff if the pilot knew what they were doing. Wakefield's handler had confirmed the window. They had 55 minutes. At 0412, the convoy found them. Not the blocked convoy, a second element, vehicles she hadn't tracked, coming in from a lateral approach that bypassed the blocked road entirely. 4 vehicles, 2 trucks and 2 SUVs, 8 personnel dismounting. And behind the vehicles, moving on foot from the jungle's eastern margin, Hayes. He was in body armor. Hayes was a staff officer, a metrics and reports man, but he'd come to the field, which told her he understood what was on the line here. Not just her, what was in her pocket. "Cross," his voice carried across the clearing, controlled. "This doesn't have to be a further incident. You have stolen government property and destroyed coalition infrastructure. Stand down and surrender the drive. The rest of this can be managed. She said nothing. 8 personnel, 8 weapons, 4 vehicles, and 45 minutes until the extraction window. A direct engagement was not survivable. She looked at the vehicles. All running. Engines meant fuel systems meant disable options. She looked at the truck positions relative to the extraction corridor the pilot would need. The trucks, she said quietly, not the people. Tire shots. SUVs, Wakefield said. Move. She repositioned 30 meters left. Low crawl under the tree line, shoulder protesting. Prone at the truck's right rear, 180 meters, clean thermal shot. She fired twice. Tire on the first round, axle housing on the second. From the south, 2 shots from Wakefield. The SUVs lurched simultaneously. Hayes's personnel scattered to the clearing edge. She was already repositioning. Mercer, she said. He was at the clearing's north margin with the satellite phone to his ear. Caldwell is live, he said. She has an FBI liaison team standing by. They needed the drive number to authorize the warrant. I need the drive serial. She reached into her pocket, read him the serial number from the drive's base label. 14 digits, twice. She heard Mercer relay it, heard him say, confirmed receipt, and then a longer exchange she couldn't parse at distance. Hayes was shouting. She couldn't hear the words from this angle, but she could see him. He'd moved to the cover of the disabled truck, and he was directing his people with hand signals, trying to establish a cordon around the clearing before the window opened. He wasn't going to make it. She'd taken his mobility, but he had radio, and whatever he called in next was going to determine whether the extraction window at 0500 became a window or a trap. She needed to close the radio. She was moving toward the truck line, 20 meters from Hayes's position, using the disabled vehicle as an angular barrier, when the shot came from the eastern margin. She hadn't cleared the eastern margin. She'd accounted for the personnel from the vehicles, accounted for Hayes, accounted for the approaches they'd come from. She hadn't accounted for a stay-behind, a single shooter placed in the jungle before the convoy arrived, covering the eastern flank in case of exactly this kind of lateral repositioning. The round wasn't aimed at her. She heard it pass, the particular directional crack of a round going past your position, and turned, and Mercer was down. He'd been standing at the clearing's north margin with the satellite phone still in his hand. The phone was on the ground. He was on the ground beside it, and he'd gotten his hand to his thigh, which told her the round had gone into the leg. But the way his hand was pressing told her it was high and medial, and she did not want to think about the anatomy of that. She covered the distance in 8 seconds, got her hands on him. "Stay still," she said. "I'm aware." His voice was compressed but controlled. 62 years old, a rope-burn arm, and now a thigh wound, and his voice was still controlled. The phone. Did Caldwell copy the serial? She copied it. She was working the dressing, her last one, applying it to the wound with both hands, pressing, feeling the pulse of blood under her palm that was fast but not catastrophic. Stay still. Pressure. The eastern shooter. I'll handle it. She looked up. Wakefield was moving east, already responding to the same contact. Wakefield has it. From the east margin, a single shot, then silence. Wakefield's voice carrying, "East is clear." Mercer's hand found her forearm. The grip was strong, stronger than she'd expected from a man who was bleeding through a thigh wound. "The phone," he said again. "Pick it up." She picked it up. The line was still active. She put it to her ear. A woman's voice, precise, professional. The voice of someone who had been in this kind of situation before, from the other end of a satellite connection. "This is Caldwell. I have the drive serial. I have the document package from Mercer's file, and I have a federal warrant application submitted as of 4 minutes ago. A judge is standing by for review. I need 30 minutes. We have 40. She pressed harder on Mercer's thigh. He made no sound. "Do you have law enforcement en route?" FBI and DIA joint team. They need to reach FOB Sentinel, ETA dependent on aviation. Tell them to take Sentinel and hold Hayes's personnel. Hayes is at my current position, grid 531, but his team has Sentinel. Copying grid 531. Cross, the drive needs to be physically intact. Whatever happens at your location, the drive needs to survive. It'll survive. She took Mercer's hand and pressed it against the dressing. Hold pressure. Hard. He held pressure. His face was drawn and pale in the thermal's green light, but his grip on the dressing was steady, and his eyes were open and tracking. He was going to make it if she got him out in the next 40 minutes. She stood, checked the clearing. Hayes was behind the truck. He had 2 personnel still on his feet. The others had broken contact or gone to ground in the margin. He had a radio in his hand, and he was talking into it. But the expression on his face, even at this distance, had changed. Something had shifted in the composure. He'd heard the satellite phone. He'd heard Caldwell's name. He knew what was coming. She walked into the clearing, directly, in the open. 12 meters of open ground that she'd calculated would be the last place he expected her to be, because the last place a sensible person goes is the open when there are weapons in the trees. She stopped in the center of the clearing, rifle at low ready, not raised, not threatening. Hayes. Her voice carried. The rain had eased to a mist again. The clearing was quiet except for engines. There's a federal warrant in process right now, 30 minutes. FBI and DIA are en route to Sentinel. Whatever you're calling in, wherever that goes, the warrant gets there first. She paused. Put the radio down. He looked at her across the clearing, 60 meters. The composure on his face was a structure now, not a quality, something built and maintained through effort, showing its effort. She watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. Everything he'd built, everything he'd managed, the 14 months, the 11 million, the auditors rerouted and the signal traffic manufactured, and the mission profile constructed to justify the presence that justified the payments. All of it coming apart in a clearing in the Darién with a staff sergeant standing in the rain. He put the radio down. She exhaled once. Then she went back to Mercer. The fixed wing arrived at 0503. It was a Cessna Caravan, civilian registration, flown by a pilot who did not introduce himself and showed no interest in who was boarding or why one of them was being carried. He'd done this before. He took the flight plan he was handed and said nothing. Mercer was loaded first, lying across the rear seats with his leg elevated and the dressing still holding. Wakefield had added his own medical supplies. The man had a field kit that suggested he'd anticipated needing it. Evelyn got in last. Checked the shoulder. It was seeping but stable. The caravan took off before dawn found the clearing. At 0547, while they were still airborne, Mercer keyed the satellite phone with a hand that wasn't occupied with holding his dressing. Caldwell answered on the second ring. The warrant came through, Caldwell said. Judge signed at 0531. FBI team is wheels up to Sentinel. DIA is sending a separate team to handle Wakefield's materials. The drive. Mercer's voice was thinner than it had been in the clearing, the compression of blood loss showing at the edges. Tell me it's enough. The drive, the configuration sheets, and the file you sent me before access cut. Together, it's enough for a criminal referral. Meridian Logistics, the contractor payment chain, and at least 3 individuals within the task force chain of command. A pause. Hayes is one of them. The others are above his level. Mercer closed his eyes. Not in relief, in something more measured than relief. The particular expression of a man who had been right about something for a long time and was now finding out that being right was its own specific kind of exhaustion. Evelyn took the phone. Caldwell, my status. You'll need to report to Fort Meade for a formal debrief. Your chain of command action, the unauthorized discharge, the infrastructure destruction. That'll be reviewed. But the context of the review just changed significantly. A careful pause. I won't make promises I can't keep, but I can tell you that the people reviewing your actions will have full access to everything we have. That's enough, Evelyn said. She handed the phone back to Mercer, looked out the window. The jungle was below them now. Endless, green, receiving the first gray light of dawn across its canopy. Somewhere in it, FOB Sentinel was processing the arrival of federal law enforcement. Somewhere in it, a blocked convoy road was still blocked, and a destroyed tower was cooling in the rain. From the seat across the aisle, Wakefield was looking out his own window. She studied his profile. Prior, she said, not an accusation. He turned. It was the right call. Maybe. She held his gaze. I still don't know. He nodded once. That's the correct position to hold. He looked back out the window. I knew you'd make the right call at the tower. I didn't know you'd do it that cleanly. The geological survey. Mercer, something that might have been appreciation. He didn't cede that information to control your decision. He ceded it so you'd have everything you needed to make it. She looked at Mercer. He was listening behind closed eyes. At 62 years old with a thigh wound and a rope-burned arm and a terminated contract, still tracking every word. Get some sleep, she told him. I'm resting, he said. Same thing. Completely different. But he didn't argue. She settled back. The caravan flew northwest. Below, the jungle held its silence and its secrets and its rain. The official after-action report for Operation Sentinel Watch described the operation as a successful disruption of a coordinated insurgent logistics network. It noted the destruction of a relay communications tower, the disruption of a supply convoy, and injuries to one contractor liaison and one U.S. Army sniper. It noted significant intelligence value. It did not mention Meridian Logistics Solutions, the $11 million, the fake signal traffic, or the 5 individuals subsequently referred for federal prosecution. That information was in a different document, 214 pages, filed by the Department of Justice Office of Inspector General, cross-referenced with financial records, contractor invoices, and data from a single external hard drive with a 14-digit serial number. 3 of the 5 accepted plea agreements. The other 2 were still pending trial when Evelyn Cross completed her debrief at Fort Meade and was informed that the investigation of her conduct had been closed without action. Her actions had been taken under circumstances of command failure and had demonstrably served the interests of legitimate oversight. She was offered reassignment, a desk position initially, then field qualification pending medical clearance. She chose field qualification. 6 weeks later, different jungle, different country, different hemisphere, same quality of silence. The particular weight of canopy and rain and the things that move through both. She'd been in position for 7 hours. Her shoulder had healed well enough. The scope was steady. The mission was different this time, not counter-sniper, an observation tasking attached to an inspector general team conducting a field assessment of a contractor logistics operation that had flagged anomalies in its supply chain reporting. She was there to watch, to document, to provide security for a process that required someone to be paying attention at distance. She thought about Hayes's face in the clearing, the composure failing, the radio going down. She thought about Mercer, 3 weeks out of surgery, already talking about returning to some form of advisory work. She'd told him to rest. He'd said the same thing he'd said in the caravan, completely different. At 13:40, her radio clicked. The IG team lead checking her status. Sector clear, she said. Watching. Copy. A pause. Anything unusual? She scanned the sector, the tree line, the access road, the logistics depot where 2 contractor vehicles were being loaded with equipment that did not, on paper, match the manifest she'd been given. Yes, she said, stand by. She began cataloging. In her breast pocket, beneath the rifle sling and the vest plate, there was a different drive now. Empty. Waiting. The battlefield, she'd learned, was never geography. She pressed her eye to the scope, started building the picture.